The last thing we have to do is retrieve those user defaults that we've saved to start our app at the last row the person selected, the user selected. So we are going to implement that functionality in the viewDidLoad method so that whenever the view loads, it puts in the right row. So we've got we're going to kind of refactor this a little bit. I'm going to clear out some things. I don't think I need my view right now. I just want to look at my view controller. There we go. So now I've got lots of real estate. So I'm going to let's do this. Let's change some things. I'm going to let my row equal initial picker row. I'm going to create an initial picker row method that's going to pick the first row. And we'll implement that functionality in just a second. And so Celsius picker, everything else is the same. I'll leave that there for a second. So let's go ahead and implement the initial picker row method. So function initial picker row. It's not going to take any parameters, but it is going to return an int, which will be correspond to the row that I want to use, or I want to start at. Okay, we're going to implement this in a second. We want to load from the user defaults. If we find a value, a row index, return it. Otherwise, return the default. So I'll just put that line in there, return. And remember, the default is just this bit of information right here. So let's get rid of that. Okay. And I'm going to change this, since I'm going to let row, I'll make that row and make that row. So I'm going to use this row that I'm getting when I do the initial picker row method. Okay. So this method is going to return some integer value that will be used to select the row here. Okay? So now we have to implement this part where we're loading from the user defaults. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Well, actually, let's check the Xcode documentation to look up how we can get these back. So let's go to NSUserDefaults. And you can see there's an integer for key method. This seems like what we want because a row is an integer, so we want to return the integer. If the key doesn't exist, this method returns 0. Okay, well that's okay. So let's use integer for key. So we can delete this comment. We'll say let saved row equal NSUserDefaults dot standard user defaults. Okay, the same thing we did before. Dot integer for key, and the default name is the key we set before, or user defaults last row key. Okay? And again, this is why having a constant is a good idea, so that we don't have to change this in multiple places if this changes. So the saved row, it's going to find this value or this key and return that integer value. Okay? Now remember, if that saved row is not equal to 0, remember it said if there was no value, it returns 0. So if it's not equal to 0, return that saved row. Else, return the default value. Okay, so if there is a value, return it. Otherwise, do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And we'll put it at about 29 degrees Celsius, 84. Let's go ahead and shut this down. Start it up again. And we see that it does go back to our last saved value. So this app is working correctly. One last thing. What's going to happen if the user selects the first temperature in the picker view? In this case, it's negative 100. Remember what position or what row that is. It's row 0 because arrays are 0 indexed. What would that look like? Let's see what happens here. Okay, so let's go. Again, it's showing you the last default. Let's go ahead and move it all the way down to negative 100. Okay, so it shows me the right temperature. So when I quit this app, I want it to show me negative 100 again. So let's go ahead and shut it down, restart it, and it goes back to 32, which is the default. Okay. Why is that? Well, because it was 0. And so if you look at our code, it is 0, so it's going to return the default. So that's a problem. Now, granted, it's probably a rare occurring problem, but it's a problem nonetheless, and we want our app to work for all instances. So let's see if there's another way we can return a value. So I'm going to hit Command-Shift-O to go back to our API information. And instead of integer for key, let's look for object for key. So it's going to return an object or nil if the key was not found. And when we think of nil, we tend to think of optionals. So this may be even better for what we want it to do. So let's go ahead and update this. So instead of integer for key, we're going to use object for key. And again, the default name is user defaults, last row key. But remember, this is an object, and we want an integer. So whenever we have, we're returning an object like this, we want to downcast it. So I want to return this, let's save row, I want to do it as an integer. Okay. So it's taking this object, and it's called downcasting, so as, with a question mark, an integer. And now we have to check what to do. If you remember the idea of optional binding, that's what we're going to do in this case. We're going to check to make sure that what gets returned is not nil. Okay? So when this comes back, the saved row, because it's an optional, it's either going to be an integer or it's going to be a nil value. So we're going to do optional binding. We're going to do if let row equal saved row. Okay? So that means, does this have a value? If it does, return that row. Otherwise, return the default. So this is, again, an example of optional binding. If it is not nil, return the row. So if there's some value here, otherwise return the default row. And now let's see if this works the way we expect it to. Let's move this all the way down. Okay, negative 148. Let's go ahead and stop our app from running, start it up again, and it works exactly as we intended it to. So now our app is going to work for every case, and it's much more functional from a user perspective. So we've actually done a lot of complicated things here. We've implemented model view controller paradigm. We've done NSUserDefaults. So we've done a lot of different things in this app. So we will continue to do more as we move on to level 3 applications.